this afternoon. Really a great pleasure to be doing this because this is a topic that we have very gradually learned more about over the years. And suddenly this year we had a big bonanza in terms of donations of artifacts that had been preserved by a family that had been the landlords of the woman they knew as Mona Montgomery. And they knew she'd been an actress in the early days of film. But these items were in a house in Los Angeles for many, many years until they were donated recently by the estate of the family, which I'll talk a little bit more about as well. But here are just a few of the photographs that came from that donation. And as you can see, they were exposed, as a lot of these images and artifacts tend to be over time. So there's a bit of damage, but still, just to have anything like this in the number that we have and the range is just pretty spectacular. So we'll be talking about this young woman, Josephine M. Workman, who was known professionally in the early silent film days as Princess Mona Darkfeather. I'm not a film historian, so I'll do my best to cover that part of it. But really what I'd like to do is give you a fairly comprehensive view of the life of this person and some of the amazing ups and downs that she had, as many of us do. The donation came from the Baltazar G. Madrid estate. As I said, they were landlords of Mona's for many years until her death in the late 1970s. And then here's just a few more samples of what came out of that collection donated this past summer in two different blocks of gifts. So pretty exciting. And while there were pieces of furniture, photographs, some documents, photo albums, those sorts of things, one of the more exciting parts of this were 4 film canisters. And the trick there, knowing as little as I do about film, was that you want to make sure that you're getting those analyzed, looked at, make sure that they're safe, because nitrate, for example, it can be a very dangerous material. And so actually Alex was of great help with this. And I'm going to ask her to jump back on so she can talk about what we did with her taking the film down to the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences to figure out what to do with this stuff.
Yes. So on July 13th, I took 4 film canisters that were found in this collection to Melissa Levesque, who is the Nitrate curator for the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. And I met her at their film archive in Hollywood. And due to COVID, I could not enter the building to give her the canisters and to see her do her fascinating work. So she had me wait out in my car in the parking lot as she whisked them off into her office. So here in the picture you see there on the left, there is Melissa getting very excited to take these canisters in to see what we've got inside. She returned about 15 to 20 minutes later. This was a quick job for her. She's got a lot of experience. And she reported the following. 2 of the canisters were what she called a total loss with stage 5 nitrate decomposition. So that's what you see in the middle image on your screen. They were so decomposed, she said, you could just push your finger right through the reel. So we could get nothing from them. So she kindly offered to dispose of those for us in a safe fashion. But the big surprise was that the other 2 were completely free of decomposition. They had 0 deterioration with just some mild warping that she said was not unusual at all. Better yet, she discovered that they were a matching picture print and soundtrack positive from 1929. And they were featuring Helen Kaiser and Joel McCrea. They were both approximately 300 feet in length, and they appeared to be test reels for RKO. So Melissa did us the kind favor of putting those in archivally sound canisters, and I brought them back to the Homestead. So now we are going to be deciding whether they are donated to the Academy or stored there on a long-term deposit. In registering for today's program, we had one viewer who might be here. Yes, she is here with us. I see her name, Betsy Metzger. Betsy had asked when she signed up for the Zoom, because she is familiar with the Joel McCrea Ranch, which is in Thousand Oaks, about what we know about the film. And sadly, Betsy, and those of you who are with us today, we don't know what the film is. Melissa happens to be a Joel McCrea fan. She recognized him right away as she was checking the film. So she's curious herself and was gonna, kind of think about what it might possibly be. But once we hear or learn more, or we're able to see more of that film, we will certainly share updates.
All right, thanks, Alex. And,
Sure.
And regarding Helen Kaiser, what I was just showing on the previous screen here, on the bottom right is a handwritten note. The paper is maybe 3x5, and it's probably in Frank Montgomery's hand. He was the husband and director, producer of Mona Darkfeather's films during her peak period in Hollywood. And you can see on here, if you can read this, it says, Helen phones Mona, hello Mona, this is Helen, et cetera, et cetera. So the best guess right now is that Helen Kaiser, who was from Buffalo, New York, was in Hollywood very briefly in the late 20s. She may have been a protege of sorts of Frank, and perhaps work, maybe there's an idea that she could work with Frank Montgomery and Mona Darkfeather on a project. Obviously, we don't know if anything ever got past that stage of writing stuff down on paper, but the fact that the film was in the possession of Mona for many, many years suggests obviously that there was some kind of working relationship that was going on there. And who knows, maybe we'll find out something more in the future about that. And maybe a Helen Kaiser relative is out there somewhere we can try and track down and learn more about her as well. All right, so this really amazing donation from the Madrid estate just totally opened up a lot more of our knowledge about this individual. So what I'd like to do is kind of give you some indication of other people who've been involved in helping us flesh out this story over the years. There is a descendant of the Workman family, a great nephew, I believe it is, Doug Nielsen, who was a docent and volunteer for us for many years. Doug now lives in Northern California. For many years, he had been trying to learn as much as he could about his ancestor and her story. And so he's provided a lot of information as well as donations, including these items here on the screen, which he had acquired over the years. A poster that would promote one of her films, Justice of the Wild, a signed photograph that was actually given to somebody named Bert, as we can see up here in the top left corner. And so Doug was really, really dedicated to trying to find out as much as he could about Princess Mona Darkfeather, Josephine Workman. Earlier this year, we had some donations from the estate of Josette Temple, who is from the Workman and Temple families in another branch. She actually had a photograph of the wedding of Josephine's parents. We had not seen a proven photo of Josephine's father, for example, and that was kind of important for us at the Homestead since he was directly connected. And then just after that, John and Elaine Krebs, who were also Workman family members who live up in Oregon, donated some photo albums, and there were some images of her parents that came out of that. So I've been at the museum for 33 years. We had virtually nothing for most of that time, and we've had a huge windfall just this last year. So you never know, as collectors or as museums, what can pop up out of the woodwork. And this is an example of that. So this is the wedding photo of Josephine's parents, Joseph Workman and Josephine Belt, and their wedding party, San Francisco in 1869. So having these visual aids just gives us obviously a better ability to tell the story or stories that we're aiming to share with the public. Now, a lot of this is about something that has been of more interest and attention in recent years in the film industry, which is how to deal with characters of a different ethnicity or race than the actor may be. And we're a lot more aware what the ramifications of that are, or interested in what the ramifications are. But in the early days of Hollywood, it wasn't quite that way. So you would have Anglos playing Indians, and you would have Latinos playing Indians, and you could have Native peoples playing Native Americans as well. In Princess Mona's case, there was advertising that suggested, as the one here in the bottom says, Princess Mona Darkfeather, the daughter of a famous Indian chief. So someone reading that would assume that she was a legitimate Native American. But in other promotional materials, they were pretty honest about that she was not a Native person, that she was from a Latino family. They wouldn't say it quite that way, and I'll get into that briefly. But the idea of appropriating another ethnicity for the purposes of playing a role, it's something that is of great interest now. And in fact, another person that I want to acknowledge as part of this, Angela Alice, who's a film historian and has a book coming out next spring on this topic, which we can share at the end, has been very helpful in trying to get me straight and the museum straight on how to approach this kind of a topic, because it is got a lot of different levels and ramifications to it. Now, the story of the family is, as many of our stories are, a lot more nuanced than we might assume from, in this case, PR for Princess Mona Darkfeather. She had ancestry from England, from the Eastern United States, from South America, and from the Southwestern United States, or the Northwestern part of Mexico, more specifically. So her grandfather, William Workman, shown here on the left, was from the remote northern part of England, close to the Scottish border, wound up in New Mexico in the 1820s, where he had a common law relationship with a woman named Nicolasa Workman, who was from Taos. Now, Taos had a pueblo that was occupied primarily by those who were more Spanish, Mexican, and a few Anglos, but there was also, and still is, the indigenous or native pueblo. And so it's a little hard for us to be able to say without better documentation, was Nicolasa Workman a Taos Pueblo Indian? What kind of mixture may there have been in terms of Spanish ancestry, that sort of thing. And without having family members on any kind of register or rolls to document that, we're really making spotty guesses about that. But in any case, there were two children born of that relationship. The Workmans, William and Nicolasa, did have a church marriage here in California about 15 years after they got together. And there's a whole story behind that, which I won't share, but as to why. But there was a daughter, Antonia Margarita, born in 1830. And then her brother, Jose Manuel, or Joseph, born, we think, about 3 years later in 1833. Both children were baptized in the church at the Indian Pueblo. But again, while that may be suggestive, it is certainly not determinative as to what their origins may or may not have been. On the other side, there was George Gordon Belt, who is Josephine's grandfather through her mother. He was from Maryland, came with the hordes of gold seekers in the late 1840s, was an early settler of what we now know as Stockton in the San Joaquin Valley of Central California. He married Viviana Osorca, who was from Chile. There were many Chileans who came to California during the gold rush years, gold miners and what have you. And as best we can tell, this is Viviana Osorca here at the wedding, which was at late 1869. George Belt, as shown in this photo of his tombstone, had been killed or had been really assassinated by a gentleman in June 1869 in Stockton. And his daughter married several months later. So obviously we don't have photos of him, but just to give you an idea of sort of the background of the family and the different origins at play here. So among the recently found photographs, this came from the Krebs family, just literally within maybe the last 6 or 8 weeks, are photos from that wedding group of Joseph, Josephine's father, and Josephine, her mother. And so they wound up having several children. What had happened was that Joseph was brought to California when the Workman family migrated from New Mexico in 1841. And his parents settled on the Rancho La Puente. William Workman was given half of the property, almost 24,000 acres, actually a little more than 24,000 acres, became a very successful cattle rancher and farmer there. But Joseph was sent back to the East Coast at a young age. We don't know exactly when, because his father had a sister who lived in Baltimore. And the presumption is that as a boy, and educational opportunities being very limited in Mexican era Los Angeles, that he was sent back for the purpose of getting a better education. By contrast, his sister, who I showed you before, did not get educated. She could not read or write to the best of our knowledge. She signed her name with an X on legal documents. That is not unusual for girls to not receive an education in preference to the boys. He was back east until his aunt died in the late 1840s. And then he wound up migrating to Missouri because he had an uncle, a brother of his father, who was living in central Missouri at that time. And Joseph remained there for probably about 6 years or so, late 1840s until about the mid 1850s. When that Workman family branch decided to migrate to Los Angeles and come down to La Puente to live with Joseph's parents, on the Rancho La Puente. Joseph accompanied them across the plains and down to Los Angeles. But he was at that point about 21. He was immediately sent back to the Central Valley because there was a lot of trade going on with cattle that the Workmans and Temples had here in greater Los Angeles to the gold mines. So he lived in Central California for about 15 years, superintending, running cattle operations for his father, William Workman, and his sister's husband, FPF Temple. And presumably, that's where he met Josephine, who was living in Stockton. They got married in San Francisco and then promptly came down to this area. William Workman, Joseph's father, at that point was about 70 years old. He was starting to make plans for the future. And so this map was done in 1870, shortly after the marriage, and it was giving property to family members. So here in the bottom right corner, can't see it because it's a little bit faded, but it says dwelling of W. Workman. That's the Workman house at our museum today. If you know the area at all, this road here, it was the county road, which is now Valley Boulevard. And so we are located, our museum, in the city of industry. The city of La Puente would be off here to the lower right. There were some parcels of land that were being bestowed upon some of the grandchildren of William Workman through his daughter in the Temple family. But off to the west, near the border of the San Gabriel River and one of the local creeks that came down from the San Gabriel Mountains, about 800 acres or so was granted to Joseph Workman. However, his father made it very clear in some testimony, it was given in a court case that I'll allude to later, that the property was being given really to Joseph's children, not to him. Moreover, William would not give his son the actual deed. He kept it for 3 years. There may have been some bad blood between father and son. Don't know where that came from. There's just some hintings of that. But in any case, when Joseph finally got a friend of his, William R. Rowland, who was the Los Angeles County Sheriff, and from the Rowland family that owned the other half of Rancho La Puente, to go down to the Workman house and ask for the deed, the story was that William took the document out of a trunk, threw it on the floor, making William pick it up from the floor, and then William went over to where Joseph was living here on this property. Joseph then hopped on a horse, rode into Los Angeles as fast as possible to get that deed recorded before his father changed his mind. So an interesting little tidbit about some of the early background with the family here. But Joseph and his wife, Josephine Belt, lived on this parcel for about 11 years or so, even when his father, William, and brother-in-law, FPF Temple, had a failure of their bank, one of the first banks in Los Angeles. That took place in 1876, a collapse of it. And because the Workmans and Temples borrowed money from a guy named Lucky Baldwin, they mortgaged most of their land holdings. So William had still about 18,000 acres at that time. All of that was in mortgage. And when the loan couldn't be paid back, Baldwin foreclosed. One of the few properties that was left out of that loan was Joseph Workman's holdings, because of course he had no interest in the bank. And fortunately, he had gotten that deed recorded, because if he had not, that would have been a whole different ballgame for him. But after about a decade or so, Joseph, who was raising sheep and growing crops and so forth, decided he wanted to move into Los Angeles. There was a biography that was published in the county history that was usually provided by the person, and they paid for that. And so what he said was that he moved his family for better educational opportunities, and that may very well be true. Joseph and his wife, Josephine, had several children, daughters first, and they had a couple of sons. And so the idea that maybe there were better schools in Los Angeles, not out in the sticks of La Puente, may or may not be plausible. But what they did is they leased out their ranch as they moved into Los Angeles. And where they settled was a pretty new area east of the river called Boyle Heights. Boyle Heights was known as Paradon Blanco from the Mexican era, been owned by the Lopez family. And one of the Lopez's sold some of the land to a guy named Andrew Boyle, an Irish immigrant who was in Los Angeles with his daughter. That daughter married William Henry Workman, who was a nephew of the William and Nicolasa Workman of La Puente, and therefore a cousin of Joseph. And so Joseph bought an acre next to his cousin on Boyle Avenue, on the bluffs overlooking the city, and built this very beautiful Queen Anne style mansion. You can see how lush the landscape was and all of that. So presumably he was doing quite well financially to be able to afford to build a house of this size and stature and to have the landscaping and what have you. And this is where Josephine was born. She was the only of her surviving family members to be born in Boyle Heights and not out of La Puente. She did have a younger sister who died young, but she was born in 1882. Some sources say 1883, and it's only a year difference. So I won't get into the details of what that difference may be. But in any case, she is born in a family that is living with some measure of affluence. Among the photographs that were received from the Madrid estate recently are these, a image that was one of the few that actually had an inscription, and it had her name on it, said she was age 8, so roughly 1890. This would be young Josephine in probably the backyard of her house. You can see there's dolls on the table and all that, so she's showing off what she has. And again, it's maybe an indication that the family is doing well economically, and she's able to have nice toys and that sort of thing. There was a boom of the 1880s that took place at the latter end of that decade, and so there may have been some windfall that came to the family through that, whether it was leasing their property at higher prices out at La Puente or whatever it may have been. Another neat photo from that Boyle Heights estate there. So the house is in the background, and the view we saw a couple slides earlier would have been from the other side. This is in the backyard. Really neat rustic gazebo. These were very popular during that period. So we can assume this is little Josephine here, the youngest of her family. And I would hope her mother maybe here on the left, and her older sisters. She was about a dozen years younger than her oldest sister. And so that could work out in terms of the ages. And again, we don't have inscriptions on a lot of these photographs to tell us for sure who's on there. So there's a sort of educated guesswork we're trying to do with that. I'm also hoping this is her father and mother in the 1880s or thereabouts. So probably 15 to 20 years after the photos we showed earlier. But in any case, I have this here because, as often happens when you've got booms and then you get the inevitable bust, there are going to be people who are going to be financially affected by that. And the reasons for this are not entirely clear, but Joseph and Josephine Workman got into some serious debt. They took out loans from a bank in Los Angeles and also loans with individuals. And when it came time to pay up, they were unable to do so. This is the mid 1890s. The decade was known as the gay 90s, not so much for some people at certain times. For example, there were 6 years of drought in Los Angeles County during that era. Whether that affected their leased out property at La Puente or not is not known, but also there was a national depression in 1893, and that would have had a huge impact on Americans very broadly. Whatever it was, the Workmen suddenly found themselves in a very deep financial hole. And the property at La Puente, which may have been their major income stream, was foreclosed upon and then was redeemed through a foreclosure sale by a guy named Oscar T. Bassett, who was a big capitalist in El Paso, Texas. And so Bassett came out and took possession of that property. What he had to do was to officially send a statement, legally speaking, to all the family members. And there was one of the Workman family, one of the children who was still a minor. She had not come of age yet, and that was young Josephine. She was 12, 13 years old at that time. And so I'm going to mention that now and then leave that hanging because we'll pick this part of the story up towards the end about her not being notified of her rights in terms of that foreclosure and sale of the ranch to another individual. All right, the Workmen split up. Joseph moves to one part of Los Angeles and his wife moves to another. They did not divorce, but they remained separated for about 6 or 7 years until Joseph died in 1901. Josephine lived a long life. She wound up living into her late 80s, dying in the late 1930s. But she had to figure out what she was going to do, and she's got her daughter in tow. So just a couple of examples here of how you can document some of the financial issues they had. Delinquent taxes would get published in the newspaper, so you could find that. This is an article on the bottom here about a loan of $6,000 made by an individual to Josephine. And then on the left, reference to the foreclosure of the ranch out at La Puente and how that was being done in the mid 1890s, or some folks who were creditors who actually tried to get a way to redeem the estate and pay off what was owed so they could claim it. But it wound up going to this Oscar T. Bassett, not George W. Bassett, it says here. But anyway, some examples. And then Josephine herself, as an individual, decides to declare bankruptcy. And so these are a couple of examples of what she does in 1896 as part of that. So she's in deep financial trouble, and she's got to, again, determine what she is going to do. And so what happens is that she starts to operate boarding houses. Now, boarding houses can mean different things to different people. This is the 1900 census at the top. Los Angeles and First Street, very close to City Hall, a little bit to the southeast. Josephine Workman at the top is listed as a hotel keeper. And then her daughter, with the birth month and year is January 1882, is a whistler. And for years, I found this, I think in the early 1990s in looking for census stuff. And I just had no clue what a whistler was until much later, when you could find things like this 1897 article from the Los Angeles Times for a performance at the Burbank Theater. And at the bottom, it talked about Miss Josephine Workman rendering 2 whistling solos that were pretty good, and she got the merited applause. So there were professional whistlers who would perform in live theater and that sort of thing. Also in the household is a musician named David Parton, who Josephine Workman later married. And then there are some young women, Jenny Reed and Belle Hess and Emma Westcott, all of whom happen to be dressmakers. Now, dressmaker also is a euphemism for a certain kind of working young lady. So we find that in the early 1900s, Josephine Workman winds up in the papers a fair amount because Police Chief Elton, for example, doesn't like the fact that her resort at Los Angeles and First Streets, which I just showed in the census, known as the Casa Loma Hotel, may have been having other activities than making dresses. More to the point, brothels must move here on the bottom. This is again about the same time, same location. And another police chief waging a crusade, and there were others doing this too, moral purity folks and what have you, a big movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to try to flesh out all of the red light activity going on. But all the women roomers at Casa Loma have been expelled from the house by order of the police, and they're watching to make sure that Mrs. Workman does not fill up with female lodgers, because we don't want the undesirable element into this district if at all possible. A little bit later, 1908, reference to Josephine and her rooming house at 125 Temple Street. Kind of an irony because she had a connection to the Temple family for whom that street was named. So yes, there appears to be some sordid activity going on in this branch of the Workman family. Now, what Josephine winds up doing very shortly afterwards is she has a young child. Josephine, this is the 3rd generation of Josephines in that family. Josephine Frances, who was born in 1902. Now, she had the last name Knoll because her mother did marry. She did not marry, though, until February 28th, 1906, to a musician named Harry M. Knoll. So it's not clear whether Josephine had her daughter out of wedlock with somebody else, or maybe she had her daughter with Harry and they just didn't get married until later. But there's definitely a difference in dates going on here. But young Josephine, as it turned out, wound up being quite an entertainer herself. This is in the Los Angeles Times in 1908. And it talks about her being a graceful little dancer and a sweet singer who has been entertaining people at charity gatherings in the city. So there was definitely an entertainment gene perhaps running through the family there. And so this is just one reference to that. So Josephine Workman Knoll is in her 20s. She has married this musician. She's got this young daughter, but unfortunately she goes through a series of terrible tragedies. First of all, her husband dies within a couple years of their marriage. He had liver cancer, which could be, of course, suggestive of alcoholism and maybe other things. He was only 26 years old when he passed away. In fact, he died just before that article was printed in the Los Angeles Times about his daughter. And then about 2.5 years later, on the last day, New Year's Eve, 1910, little Josephine contracts diphtheria, a disease that thankfully we don't have to worry much about because of vaccines. And she is just 9 years old when she passes away. So you can imagine the situation, obviously, for Josephine Workman Knoll to have lost her husband and daughter in short order. In the 1910 census, by the way, Josephine Knoll is listed living on Flower Street between 4th and 5th in the Bunker Hill area. She is managing an apartment hotel and has a few lodgers, but no dressmakers. Is a gas company machinist and a theater actress and her young daughter. But 1910, as all of this is going on, just happens to be when Josephine is reinventing herself and becoming an actress. So the story that she tells in some interviews, and I can read you an excerpt of one of those from 1914, about how she got into this, is that she basically answered an advertisement in the paper for somebody who had the look of an Indian. Now, again, she had been a whistler in the theater. Maybe she'd done some other stuff. She had said that she was a singer, a contralto, and that she was considered to be very good at that. So maybe she was just on the lookout for any possible opportunity to get into the entertainment business all through this period. But she apparently answers this ad and then goes down and applies to the position. She said in an interview, she didn't know much about salaries. She asked for too much, but she got it and the position. And then she said she found out afterwards that she received more than the leading ladies were getting at that studio. And so her career began at that time, 1909, 1910. These are a couple of ads from the end of 1910, December, from newspapers in other parts of the country. And so some of her early films for the Bison Theater Company, including An Indian's Test. And she is noted here as Mona Darkfeather, A Child of the Wild, another film. These were short films you would make if you were a popular actor. You could make quite a number of films in a given year. And so it's not surprising to see two films being out there at one time. But again, these ads are from, I think, December 18th and December 22nd, 1910, just a week or week and a half before her daughter suddenly passes away. But once her career gets started, it takes off in short order. And it's worth just mentioning very briefly that this is really the beginnings of the film industry in our area. We say Hollywood, but a lot of the early studios were in the area called Edendale. This would be Silver Lake area, northwest of downtown Los Angeles. And so that's where she was working, because that's where most of the films were being made at that early stage. And then gradually you start seeing studios branch out into the Hollywood area, and then later the San Fernando Valley, Culver City, that sort of thing. And so as we get into the first half of the 1910s, you start to see her getting a lot more work in films, promotion of her films, popularity of them. She starts to work with a former theater actor who would become a director named Frank Montgomery. And they wind up marrying in 1912, 1913, and have this partnership together. Eventually, she has her own production company with her husband and director as her partner in all of this. But she is doing quite successful films during this first half of the 1910s. This one on the left, this ad calls her the great exponent of Indian women in the industry, but it says very honestly, as some ads or articles would not say, that she is not a real Indian, as many suppose, having been born in Los Angeles of an old aristocratic Spanish family. Spanish was always preferable to Mexican, and aristocratic can be debated. She didn't come from one family, obviously. She came from two, and then the branches and all of that. But there were times, like I said, where she was more forthcoming about her background. Other times they would promote her as an Indian. Even when they talked about her not being a Native American, there would be things like at the bottom of this article, she speaks several Indian languages very fluently, which sounds like a good studio PR, but also a good singer. She spent time living with natives, received the title of princess from chief rising son of the Arapaho tribe. So there's this not all too surprising mixture of fantasy and fact with these things, and it can be hard to tease some of that out. Certainly has been for me as I've been going through, which is why it's helpful to have someone like Angela help guide that process. Also want to thank Mark Wanamaker of the Bison Archives. He has an amazing collection, a great historian of film, and Mark provided these images for this presentation today, early ones. The one in the upper left here was dated 1910. So there is Mona holding a rifle with some of her fellow actors at Bison Studios, a large group photo with Mona here in the middle, dated 1911. So again, it's just really great to see these images. And again, thanks to Mark for providing these for the presentation today. Just a moment to talk about her husband. So Frank Akley was born in the oil producing regions of West Pennsylvania. Petrolia was his birthplace. He wound up in Omaha, Nebraska, where his father was a barber. That may have been related to the railroad, because Omaha was a major railroad center in those days. Then later in the Pacific Northwest, he lived in Seattle and Portland for a period, by which time around the 1890s or thereabouts, he became a theater performer and actor, and married in the late 1890s, soon divorced, to an actress. How he came down to Los Angeles, it may just be that he was traveling with theater companies and then found out about the emerging film industry. His father, George, did wind up in the Soldiers' Home, which is now the VA complex in Westwood. Wound up there in the late 1890s. So it's possible there may have been a family draw to get him down here. But in any case, Montgomery was an experienced theatrical actor before he emerged in Hollywood in 1909. I'll share something a little bit later that shows that, but he was in early films. In fact, maybe among the very earliest shot in the Los Angeles area, and then went on, as I said, to become a director and producer, and of course, featuring his wife, but he also directed other actors and other types of films. So these were probably promotional photographs as he was in his early film career, or perhaps his theatrical career. And what looks like a very typical tramp character. There were so many of these, not just Charlie Chaplin, but who knows how many actors who did comedic roles playing tramps and that sort of thing. So kind of a fun photo showing him in costume there. And again, these were all from the Madrid estate donation. And her stardom just continued to grow as the years went by in that first half of the 1910s. She even went out to film in Bear Valley, and it may be that she had a sister involved in that, because one of her sisters lived out in what became the Big Bear Lake area. And so maybe there was some kind of a connection to get filmmaking done out there. Lots of great documents visually. Some of these are from the Homestead Museum collection, like this lobby card, and there were these sort of popular souvenir cards that you could buy, and photographs, full-length photographs like this are kind of rare, but they're really neat to see with the extent of the costumes that she had. Really great documents for her career. And fun things too. So this is on the left here is an article from 1914 where it talks about her background, so far as we can depend upon it for authenticity. Again, she tells the interviewer in this article, "I am not an Indian. My parents are Spanish descendants of an aristocratic family. I was born in Los Angeles." And she talks about how she was destined for the operatic stage. Who knows if that's true or not. But she said she had gone through some training until she got into the motion picture business with Bison, which had a Santa Monica location as well, and then began working with Frank Montgomery. She was asked about how she knew of her Indian lore, and she said she'd always had an interest, and there were many of them out at Santa Monica when she was working for Bison, come from different tribes, and went into her collection and all of that sort of thing. So you can find these sources here and there where she talks about her background. But again, trying to parse out how much of that is real and that is a little bit tricky. I love this little tidbit here. And again, Angela turned me on to a source that had all kinds of great material from professional trade magazines as well as other sources, but a poem about "My darling Princess Mona, my heart is in a whirl. I love to watch her acting, you pretty little girl." Not the best versification out there, but kind of fun to read. And it even makes references to other actors, to the impresario Belasco, and the playwright Marlowe. So kind of a fun little poem there. I'll leave it up just for a second if people want to get a chance to look at that. Then I can get a little drink of water. So again, was she or wasn't she a native? It depended on what the advertising was and who was reading it where. So you'll see something where this ad says for the piece of Bear Valley, which I think refers to the filming location up in the mountains above San Bernardino, but it calls her a real Indian maiden. Princess Mona Darkfeather we saw earlier, the great exponent of Indian women. You could read that headline and think that she was, if you didn't read the article, but then right beneath that, she's not a real Indian. She's from an aristocratic Spanish family and so forth. But part of this too is, as her career proceeds, is trying to break out of the typecasting a little bit. So she played some characters, as you can see, where she's not wearing her Indian garb. These are Western films. An example, The Bottled Spider, which I think was the later part of 1914 through the Kalem studio. But you can see she's maybe trying to branch out, find different roles to play. And then there was even when she joined David Horsley for Centaur production, she does a series of films based on the British explorer Stanley in Africa. And you get in a whole dimension here too about the representation of Blacks and Black Africans in particular with this series. There are some photographs that we have from the Madrid estate donation where you can see some actors are African Americans and some are in blackface. But in any case, she's not wearing her Indian garb here. She's playing a different kind of character as she's trying to branch out and do a different kind of representation for her career. Here are a couple of photos, in fact, from that collection from the Madrid estate, where she's got her explorer garb on. And you can see the one in the bottom here. She is underneath an elephant. And they stop, take a photograph of her, so it gives you a dramatic representation of what she's doing with her acting. On the top here, while there are Black men portraying extras in the background, this woman is clearly in blackface. So if that person had any kind of a role where there's a line that has, you know, a representation of speaking parts, then that's where you find the blackface characters coming into being. And so it's just a representation of where the situation was at that time in the film industry. As you get to 1915 and afterwards, her career slows down quite a bit. And whether this is partly just changing tastes, people are not as interested maybe in Indian maiden films. Is it her own advancing age? She is in her mid-30s by that point. How long can you play an Indian maiden? There may be a variety of reasons why this could be, but she's starting to do fewer and fewer films as the decade is approaching an end. The last documented films in which she had a starring role appeared to be about 1917. This is her listing in a trade publication from about that time, and the 1917 ad for what she is working on for one of the subsidiaries, I think, of Universal, but still doing some Indian films in 1917. And again, some ads also from that period. Whatever happened, whatever the reasons were, she is no longer making films in the Hollywood setting. She and Frank Montgomery pull up stakes and they move to the Northwest, where, as I mentioned earlier, he had a background living in Portland, Seattle, working in theater up there. And they're apparently trying to do a couple of things. One is she goes on a theater tour, which appears to have been limited primarily to the Northwestern states, again, Oregon, Washington, Idaho. And she's in live theaters. They put up these displays outside the venue. She goes out to meet her fans. This again comes from the Madrid estate, but there's a library in Tacoma, I think, that has a great photo of the theater where she was performing. Noticeably, it's cut off here, but it says Mona Darkfeather. It says lecturer and singer as well. So it's kind of like a multifaceted live stage act that she was doing. This is in 1918. And occasionally you'll find references to what they were trying to do in some of the trade publications or newspapers. For example, there was reference to the fact that they were involved with a short-lived motion picture company in Spokane in Eastern Washington. For a while, they had an affiliation with a film company in San Francisco and as well in Portland, Oregon. So it looks like they were trying to find some way to keep her working. And I don't know if there were too many advances they made in that direction. I don't know if there were any films that were actually made, but there were a few articles there in the late teens and even into the early 20s about her wanting to pursue making films. This interesting article in the bottom right here talks about the fact that she had a personal engagement at a theater, and that said in her 8 years experience, she played in more than 500 pictures, which is supposed to be a record. And again, that sounds like a little bit of PR inflation there, but working for different companies, Original Bison, Selig, Universal, Kelum, and Mutual during her career. But again, this is towards the late 1910s when she is not nearly as active as she once was. Again, just some other examples of mention of her or her husband in Portland, Oregon. These are 1919 era. He had been, that is Frank, again, listed here erroneously as Walter, had been working for Fox, trying to get Fox Pictures distributed in Northwestern theaters, apparently. This is the San Francisco article I talked about earlier, where she appeared at an event. This is during World War I in San Francisco, to sing a Red Cross song, which she had composed for the occasion. So I think she's trying to find a way to keep her name out there and hope that she could rebuild her career. When her husband registered for the draft during World War I, this is September 1918, he listed himself as photoplay star manager in Seattle. So obviously Josephine was still hoping to try to find her way back to stardom at that point. What did keep her name in the public eye for at least a little while longer was that some of her films were re-released, kind of like a second run type of thing. So these are ads from 1919, 1920, where theaters could acquire these films to be able to show out in the public again. And you can see these ads for some of her movies in the early 20s. The latest I found was from Visalia in 1928. So there appeared to have been some kind of a market for her films, usually at the bottom of the list of films for that showing, but at least she was still getting her movies shown out there. But they started to dry up after about 1921 or thereabouts. Angela had pointed this to me in a trade publication. George Melford had been a director of hers in the early teens. This is 1927. He's making a film called Rocky Moon. And John Bowers is the star. This is Melford and Mona shown here. And so she may have had an uncredited role in that film. By that point, she was about mid 40s, 45. So if she was, this would have been her last documented role, at least so far. And this is the ad for 1928 from Visalia, where one of her films was being shown up there. In the meantime, I had made reference to the fact that when she was a young girl, her parents, her father specifically, had lost that property out on the Rancho La Puente. And what she did about 1920, she filed suit in Los Angeles County Superior Court, claiming that she had not been properly notified of her loss of rights to that, because she was a minor. She was supposed to get notified through a legal proceeding about what's happening to that property. So it's what, 15 years later, and she is filing suit in court. And the original determination by the judge was that it was too late, that she did not have a right to claim anything of what was then known as the Bassett Ranch. However, she filed another court case in Superior Court, and she got a more sympathetic judge, Burnell, who ruled in her favor, saying that she would get $130,000. Now, you can imagine how much money that would have been in 1921 when that ruling was made, and also a 1/9 interest in the property. So walnuts or whatever else was being grown out there. Unfortunately, the joy was short-lived there, because when Bassett filed an appeal and went to the state Supreme Court, and in 1922, they reversed Judge Burnell's judgment and determined that the first judge, Lewis Works, had made the right determination and that she did not have any right to the property. At the bottom of this article, it says that the lapse of 17 years nullified any right that she had to sue for the interest in the property. I should add, it wasn't just her. She was suing on behalf of herself and some of her surviving siblings and a sister-in-law. In any case, she had a brief shining moments of wealth staring her in the face before it was taken away by the state Supreme Court in 1922. After she retired, she kind of receded into the background. Her husband, Frank Montgomery, did continue to work in the film industry, camera operator, later working on set in different capacities. And so in 1920, they were residing in Los Angeles she was going by the name of Mona Montgomery, with her sister Agnes and her husband in a fourplex. And Frank was listed as director, motion picture director. I don't know if he was actively directing at that stage, but he certainly appeared to have continued working in the industry. Mona did not have an occupation listed. Director was crossed out and just said none. And then by 1928, the two had split up. Frank went on and married a cosmetician, stayed married with her for a few years, while Mona married a capitalist from Monrovia out in the San Gabriel Valley named Alfred Westling. Westling was known a little bit because he briefly was married to a well-known female attorney, Oda Falconer, who was kind of a prominent figure in Los Angeles. And then when Westling and Falconer divorced, he and Mona married. And so in the 1930 census, they're living in Monrovia. She is basically housewife while her husband is working in banking. But their marriage wound up dissolving in 1936, just about the time that Frank and his wife break up. So there's a brief return to the media and the spotlight at the end of 1937 when Frank Montgomery and Mona Darkfeather remarry. So this obviously drew the attention of some media because it's kind of a neat story. A couple had been involved in the early days of Hollywood, separated and divorced, and then got reunited. And there was some reference to her career as part of that. There's a Hollywood Citizen newspaper on the left and the Los Angeles Times on the right, including the photograph you see here of Mona and Frank. This article had been sent to the museum when I first started in 1988. This is about the only thing we knew about her at all, was that there was a reference in the second paragraph here or second part of it. Miss Darkfeather, a member of the pioneer workman family of Los Angeles, but we had no idea at that time what branch she was from. So we've come a long way in 33 years with our knowledge. When they remarried, Montgomery was working for Hal Roach. Roach Studios was part of MGM in those days. So in the 1940 census, it shows Montgomery as working, actually under his name of Frank Akley, but it says chief whistleman for Hal Roach Studios, which I interpreted to mean he's kind of quieting the set as we're getting ready to shoot. And maybe somebody who's tuning in might know what that terminology refers to. In 1942, when he registers for the draft, he was 64, but you had to register at that age. He had just flown under the date of April 28, 1877 to register, but it says he works for Hal Roach in Culver City. And once in a while, you'd see his name pop up because of his role in early film. This is a snippet of a 1940 newspaper talking about a film made in May 1909 in Los Angeles, starring Hobart Bosworth, who was a major silent film actor and theatrical performer of note before that. Made it a so-called studio at 8th and Olive Streets where there was a Chinese laundry, and they made a film. The name of it was something like In the Realm of the Sultan or something like that. But Montgomery was a Turkish harem merchant, which sounds to me not unlike maybe what Josephine Workman was doing in Los Angeles in the first part of the 1900s with a harem. Montgomery, though, died in 1944 at the age of 67. And so, interestingly, this little obituary made no mention of his wife at all. It just said that he worked for Universal. He had directed Ruth Roland, a major name in those days, and other stars. Left his widow, but didn't mention the fact that she had been a prominent silent film actress of her own right. The only other mention I found of her after 1944 was the fact that when her brother, William J. Workman, died in 1956, he and his siblings had been trying to pursue a claim for Alcatraz Island, which had been granted by the last governor of the Mexican era of California, Pio Pico, to William Workman, the grandfather of William J. and Princess Mona. The island was then handed over to FPF Temple, who was the son-in-law of the original grantee. And then when the United States invaded and seized California in 1846 and 47, John Fremont, who was a major figure in that, acquired the island on behalf of the federal government, basically on an IOU. He promised, he gave a promissory note for $5,000 to FPF Temple, and it never got delivered. In fact, Fremont was court-martialed for many things, including making this deal without getting approval from the superiors, which he had a habit of doing. But what the government did is they took possession of Alcatraz. It still remains federal property today. It's now a National Park Service historic site, but it was used as a variety of things, military, for quite a while before becoming a federal prison. And so different members of the Workman and Temple families from basically the 1850s to the 1970s, on and off, pursued claims for Alcatraz Island. And so that wound up in the papers in 1956, and it mentioned that William J. Workman had some older sisters, Mrs. Montgomery, the former actress, and a couple other sisters. Other than that, she lived in obscurity basically until she died in September 1977, 95 years old, 94 according to the death certificate here. And when she was buried at Holy Cross Cemetery, because she was under public guardianship, as shown here on her death certificate, she was buried in an unmarked grave at that Catholic cemetery in Culver City. And Doug Nielsen, who I mentioned earlier, her relative, put a tombstone for her quite a number of years ago, as shown here on the right. So finally giving her recognition at the cemetery, both her given name and her film name. So as a wrap up here, I just wanted to share some more of the photographs that came out of the Madrid estate donation. Just really wonderful images of Princess Mona on set, on location and so forth. Just really fun images to see. And again, somewhat ragged for wear, but we're just lucky to even have these things because in so many cases, things just don't survive. And you can even see one of these again, Stanley in Africa shots with a lion laying on a table there. Just really great images from her career. And a couple here at the end of her outside of the character. And so really beautiful shots of Josephine Workman / Princess Mona Darkfeather. So with that, I want to thank everybody for listening. And I see there's some things in the chat that we'll get to, but I wanted to mention before that we do have some upcoming virtual events for you next weekend, Sunday the 19th at 2 o'clock. My colleague Robert Barron, who is a sommelier at a restaurant in Fullerton, as well as working at the Homestead as our facilities coordinator, is going to talk about fortified wine and the history of that. Very knowledgeable, he's very engaging. So if you have any interest at all in wine history, be sure to tune in for that. And then my colleagues, Jenny Trulock and Jennifer Shera, have created an escape room. And so we're presenting another presentation of the Anachronic Escape, dealing with 1928 and our La Casa Nueva historic house at the Homestead. That is on Saturday the 25th at 2 o'clock. So be sure to check that out if you're interested in escape rooms at all. You can sign up for those events at homesteadmuseum.org/upcoming/events. And please follow us at Homestead Museum on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Alex. And again, thank you all for listening.
Okay, well, a lot of nice thank yous coming in the chat there, Paul. And I think Angela was asking some of those last stills, were they from Mark Wanamaker and Bison Archives? But no, I think those were all part of the donation, correct?
That's right. So yeah, these are all from the Madrid estate. So I don't think, I did mention that they had been the landlords of her, so they had kept these things since she died in 1977. So yeah, these are all from the Madrid.
Yes. Yes, just lots of nice thank yous here. Betsy was saying, thank you for the interesting presentation. She's the one who asked the question early on about Joel McCrae.
Yeah,
and she said, keeping us updated. Yes, so if we hear more, they want to know over at the Joel McCrae Ranch in Thousand Oaks.
be happy to.
Okay. Yeah, more thank yous there. All right. We've got Cheryl on Facebook. Cheryl Temple saying great information. Mary Temple Bartley, another family member, saying thank you, Paul. Another informative presentation. Nice to have people watching on both platforms, whatever suits them, right?
Yeah, by the way, Alex, Angela did put a comment that Westerns fell out of favor when the longer features came in. So 1913 and afterwards. So thank you, Angela, for bringing that up. And then Mark said that he found several shots of her tour and that theater from the Northwest. That's great. Thanks, Mark, for pointing that out. That's awesome.
Yeah, and the pictures Mark shared were fantastic. All of them. They're really exciting to see. Yeah, it's really amazing to think about, like you said, when you first started, how many years ago, to have just a couple of pieces of information. And then, of course, you know, Doug Nielsen having collected so much as part of his family history and sharing that research and knowledge with us is just wonderful.
Yeah, some of the earliest that I remember seeing were, I think, the late 80s, maybe the early 90s. And of course, the internet hadn't come in for everybody. And so it was just bits and pieces. And I know Mark had found some stuff early on as well. So it's just, yeah, hopefully we get that body of information together and just gradually start building that knowledge better.
Yes. And Alan is suggesting maybe we might even reach out to UCLA for some help with you know, being able to see the film reels and learn more about them. I know, you know, the Academy is also just a fantastic resource and they do some work together.
And Michael Callahan had asked about any of her films existing. So I know Doug Nielsen had found one years ago that he actually provided us a copy of on videotape. And I think I've come across a couple references online to one or two films. A New Medicine Man, I think maybe one that was one of those, and there was another one. But other than that, as Angela and Mark could tell you, so many of these films, the vast majority are gone. But yeah.
Yes. And Angela's also suggesting to add the title "An Indian's Test" to Mona Darkfeather's bio on IMDb.
Yeah, that's the other thing, because you assume at some point, she had, I think one time we thought she had 70, and then you just keep finding, it won't be 500 probably, but at least you find these references. So yes, Angela, that we should definitely continue to monitor that as much as possible.
Yes. Okay, checking for any last minute comments here, questions. Not seeing anything come in. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you, Paul, for taking this wonderful collection, putting all this information together to share so people could get a nice up close look at what more we've learned about Mona. All right, so thank you, everybody. We hope to see you at another program in the very near future. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks.